Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League tries its best to be a looter shooter, a single-player campaign, and a multiplayer co-op adventure all rolled up into one. The only problem is, it falls short in nearly every single category. But how? Well, the answer is quite simple. They had absolutely no direction. You see, when big companies try to cast a wide net to catch every type of player, they end up catching no players at all, which is why, to no one's surprise, a metric ton of negative reviews have been plastered all over the internet. But despite these low ratings, what's really eating at both critics and fans is how Rocksteady Studios completely dropped the ball. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Rocksteady created the Batman Arkham Trilogy, which reshaped the ideology of not only what it meant to create superhero video games, but also implemented some of the best combat mechanics that fans still rave about till this very day. But unfortunately, we live in the modern age of gaming, full of subscriptions and live service nonsense designed with the intent of shipping now and fixing later. This becomes increasingly problematic when you consider that most games don't ever get fixed and are simply abandoned, left to decompose in the ever-growing pile known as the live service graveyard. And this ultimately leads us to one conclusion, and that's that Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League's future is looking very, very grim. Despite the scathing introduction to this video, I actually did have some fun at certain points throughout my playthrough. But to fully understand why is dependent on a few stipulations. So what do I mean by that? Well, number one, this is my first Rocksteady game ever, so the context in which I view this game is completely different to those who have a history with Rocksteady's iconic library. Number two, I'm not a huge superhero fan, so the DC and MCU have never meant that much to me, making the controversy of the main storyline not that big of a deal. Number three, every now and again, I enjoy a mindless shooter where I can listen to a podcast and just unwind after a hard day's work. Now, when you merge these 3 points together, it makes some sense why this game didn't get under my skin in the same way that it did for other people, because I'm simply not Rocksteady's target audience, and that allowed me to keep my expectations tempered upon launch. And I think this is a very important distinction to make so that you don't think I'm just a blind hater, or when I talk about the more positive aspects, you understand the context behind the points in this discussion. That being said, for those of you out there who feel the fire in your belly, I understand and empathize with your frustrations quite a bit. And while I haven't played the Arkham Trilogy yet, and I've only seen a handful of superhero movies, the impact that this type of content has made on the entertainment industry as a whole cannot be understated. So this leaves us with two perspectives in which to view Suicide Squad. The first one being the context of Rocksteady's track record in perpetuity with the expectations that they themselves have set. And the second perspective is looking at this game in a vacuum and judging it solely on its individual merits. I think a great place to start would be the campaign, because this is easily the best part of the game, but it's drawn incredibly short, and this is likely due to the development hell that this game appeared to be stuck in. Sometime after the events of Arkham Knight, characters Harley Quinn, Captain Boomerang, King Shark, and Deadshot are released from Arkham Asylum by Amanda Waller, who is the leader of a military outfit known as Argus. Waller informs the crew that Brainiac, one of the Justice League's greatest enemies, has infected a handful of major superheroes inside of Metropolis, turning them into supervillains under Brainiac's complete control with the end goal of destroying humanity. And the only way to really stop these ex-heroes is to, well, kill them. Hence the title Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. But since the Suicide Squad is known for their shenanigans, in order to make sure that they don't escape the clutches of Amanda Waller, she tricks them into injecting micro-explosives into their brains so that she has complete control over them by threatening to kill them at any time with the push of a button. Now, at first, when I read the title of this game, I was pretty surprised, because usually when it comes to superhero media, killing them is almost a no-go. I'm sure there are exceptions, however, so please feel free to correct me in the comments. I'm kind of talking about the main superheroes like Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, stuff like that. But as a person who is sick and tired of the standardized superhero tropes in Western culture, I was pretty interested to see how this was going to play out for a couple of reasons. The first reason was that it isn't often the player is the anti-hero and is able to chase face down multiple good guys inside one of the largest franchises on the planet. But the second and main reason here was that I was really curious as to how Rocksteady was going to untwist this catastrophic narrative pretzel that they had now built for themselves. Because let's face it, if we kill the Justice League, doesn't that mean future storytelling inside of Rocksteady's Arkham library dies alongside them? Well, maybe, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the video. Now, upon launching this game on my PC, I was immediately turned off by all of the 4 major playable characters. I found them to be annoying and, quite frankly, stupid. This archetype of a bad guy in modern media generally has me rolling my eyes in the back of my skull. It's always this bumbling fool that's just too stupid for their own good, but they're also simultaneously the man for the job. That being said, as the game progressed, I found myself really enjoying the voice acting and corny jokes and the predictable one-liners, especially from King Shark. I don't know why, but his dry sense of humor and aloof personality was done really well, and I found the levity of his misunderstandings to be quite comical. And honestly, I think this can be said about all the writing and character arcs across the board. Rocksteady did a tremendous job making all the protagonists feel isolated and unique at the start, but then through time and adversity, we were able to see relationships form and emotional walls fall, allowing the Suicide Squad, Argus, and the evil Justice League members fluctuate emotionally, which brought out a somewhat dynamic performance and even a surprising amount of depth inside of these characters as well. This genuinely caught me off guard, as I didn't really expect much of anything regarding a story, as this was supposed to be purely a looter shooter stuffed inside of a DC skin suit.
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
I think where this game really starts to lose people is unfortunately through its main story missions. And the irony isn't lost on me, as the campaign is what's keeping this game on life support as it is. The problem isn't the main peaks of the campaign, which have the Suicide Squad interacting with the Justice League. It's actually the content which bridges those moments together, which is really repetitive and rather uninspired. Now, we're going to talk about the gameplay portion of that in just a bit, but the primary story beats with the Justice League were very bittersweet. It was during these moments that I was finally able to see that Rocksteady magic that everybody has been talking about for years and years. From the tumultuous relationship between Boomerang and the Flash, to the darkness of Batman's cave, and all the way to Wonder Woman trying to save Superman. The voice acting and storytelling worked so well together that when it ended, I was bummed that this just wasn't a single-player story. Beautiful set-piece moments carefully crafted to the narrative, weaving in and out of the gameplay and story. I mean, there was some actual good stuff in there. A perfect example of this was inside of Batman's cave when Harley Quinn has all the Suicide Squad members open up various cans of fear gas to lure out Batman. It was such a clever and creative moment, and I bet I'm not alone in that feeling. But rather than being able to focus on what was happening inside of the game, I was more fixated on what could have been, because I was immersed. I was enjoying myself. However, after the 59th mission of killing these same bad guys in the same style mission over and over again after some epic story moments, it really starts to lose its luster.
Give me one good reason why I shouldn't terminate this program and your lives.
It really does feel like Kill the Justice League was made for about 3 or 4 different kinds of player bases, which all result in no one getting what they want, and it can be a bit of a mess at times. On one hand, there is the superhero fantasy element, and we have the looter shooter aspect, but there's also a bit of a co-op multiplayer RPG shooter. Then there's also a bit of a single-player campaign with boss fights and a storyline. It's just all over the place. And to be honest with you, I wasn't enjoying the gameplay at all for about the first 7 hours. This was primarily due to the traversal mechanics, as things felt sluggish and unintuitive, especially with Harley Quinn. But then, after a while, the combat and movement systems finally clicked with me, and I was really starting to actually have kind of a good time. The way that combat works is that each character has a traversal mechanic, a unique melee ability, and almost a certain class when it comes to the weaponry they are able to use. So for example, Captain Boomerang will use his boomerang to travel around the map, as well as his melee attack, attack, and he is also able to use rifles and SMGs as his main weapon class. Harley Quinn will use Batman's grapple gun, a hammer, along with pistols or a minigun. Deadshot can use a backpack, arm cannons, and rifles. And lastly, King Shark uses his own jumping abilities, a meat cleaver, rifles, and the minigun. Characters also have a grenade slot and will eventually be able to utilize 2 special abilities and an ultimate ability. And I have to admit here, the gunplay felt really fantastic. It was snappy, the hit detection felt nice, it just felt great to shoot stuff, which is really important for a third-person shooter. Overall, guns didn't quite have that distinction I was hoping for across the different classes, which is a bit of a bummer, so I pretty much veered towards sniper rifles as much as I could since they had a fast fire rate and could do a lot of damage at long distances. But the best aspect to combat was simply using all of the tools in your tool belt together. Rocksteady created a nice and neat combat package, and this really thrived when the player would add in elemental effects. You see, the player is able to add elemental effects to pretty much everything, from grenades to the melee weapons, and then via the loot system, players would be able to unlock certain guns that had elemental damage associated with them. And in order to apply the effects to your foes, the player simply holds down the attack they are attempting to pull off, and the game will apply said effect. So for example, with Captain Boomerang, if I held down the button while he threw his boomerang, it would apply a freeze effect that would stop all enemies in their tracks. By then holding the G key, you could throw a grenade to deal more elemental damage while also shooting them with a high tier weapon to apply even more of that elemental effect. This combined with the general gunplay, melee attack, traversal, and ultimate abilities really put me into a flow state, and I would be lying to you if I said that I didn't have fun during these moments. But like we briefly touched on earlier, Suicide Squad is paired with such plain enemy and mission design that it comes to a point where you just stop caring about what the missions are and just focus on the combat. And to be honest, I'm not sure how long that can last before players ultimately become dissatisfied. Because while a lot of the missions in this game are unique from one another, they all are tasks that you have done before, and more importantly, they all feel the exact same. It's simply just picking a mission, flying to the location, and shooting the bad guys to stop them from destroying something we have to protect, and around that hamster wheel we go. There are 1 or 2 missions that I did enjoy and were somewhat challenging and fun, mainly protecting Poison Ivy's plants from getting killed, and then another mission which had you destroying crystals that protected a larger machine, but the catch was if you weren't quick enough, the crystals would regenerate, so there was a bit of a time challenge baked in. It was decent, and it showed that Rocksteady could have made things more interesting if they would have tried, or maybe if they had more time. I don't really know how you can make something for about 7 years and say that you didn't try or didn't have enough time, but I digress. And as I mentioned, the enemies are all useless fodder that you have seen before. There is the general foot soldier, the ranged enemy, the large brute, as well as some fast enemies, and of course they all have their own elemental counterparts. It's all run-of-the-mill generic shooter crap that you have seen before, and when a package like this costs upwards of $100 to get the deluxe edition, there needs to be more content than what is currently offered, and I don't think this is something a DLC update will ever be able to fix. Even though the enemies and missions were plain, the combat was still really fun, and it clearly does a lot of the heavy lifting here. And if you're someone like myself who has only played about 30 plus hours, give or take, that might be enough for you. It kind of was for me. But for those of you who want to play for 60, 80, 100 plus hours, the depth of combat really isn't there. Everything else inside of the game that's meant to facilitate support is meaningless and empty, and I don't see how someone could dump more than about 30 or so hours in before they've had enough. Things like the skill trees and side missions, they all felt undercooked. Now don't get me wrong, these systems were flushed out enough to make them useful, but it was just a standard run-of-the-mill progression system. If we take a look at the skill tree here, most of, if not all of the nodes are stat-based for that particular character. And aside from your special abilities, which are fixed animation attacks that initiate at the click of one button, there isn't one new move or combo set that you learn throughout the entire game. And since your character skills are fixed, meaning that your arsenal is based around shooting things and mixing in your one melee attack over and over again, this means that from the start of Suicide Squad until the very moment you put down the controller or mouse and keyboard, there will be no noticeable combat skill progression. Sure, there are some interesting damage buffs or debuffs that occur from these skills once they're unlocked, and even some of them come with cool animations. For example, Captain Boomerang will have this interesting slot machine effect that will play above his character when he reaches a certain combo level. And this is kind of cool and it does add a bit of personality to the combat loop on a surface level, but that's about it. It doesn't actually do anything other than boost some damage numbers, as it's purely aesthetic. And it's moments like these that make me think deep down in the recesses of Suicide Squad's code, the real Rocksteady is there somewhere, screaming to be heard. It's such a shame that more creativity wasn't able to go into the core skill tree, because as we know, Rocksteady is able to do so much more with their combat systems. But this isn't the only problem with this progression system, as players can kinda get by without investing into it that heavily. I was pushing far into the campaign and tried out other characters that weren't really leveled up as high as Captain Boomerang, and I was able to clear basically anything I wanted, even while underleveled. I do think it's great that nothing is super level gated by any means, but on a grander scale, this means that the actual character stats aren't even that important, which is such a bummer considering just how many things there are to grind for in this game. And even after you fully level up a character, the player can open up a new skill tree that has tons of nodes, but they all are just mini stat buffs for your weapons or health. So you'll unlock a 0.5% here or a 1% there, which is just not exciting at all. The issue here isn't that skill trees are bad or anything like that. It's just that when you have a game that relies solely on a combat loop, even if the loop is good, it's up to the devs to create depth and variety. Imagine God of War Ragnarok, but with only 3 main moves that just got buffed damage stats over and over again for the course of 30 hours in a campaign. What sense does that make? And to make matters worse, all the characters play pretty much the exact same. They all have the same movesets, they have identical elemental effects applied to their loadouts, which means that you can essentially copy and paste your preferred playstyle from character to character, other than the main traversal method and the melee weapon, I guess. At the end of the day, Suicide Squad's combat feels good, but it's also immensely repetitive and lacks any depth and nuance, which in the short term, that's fine, but in order to satisfy a hardcore player base who enjoys the grind and the content inside of your game, there simply needs to be more than meets the eye. Now, when it comes to the side content, I am split about 50-50 here. It's really just more of the same mission structure copied and pasted from every other part of the game, but to be fair, the rewards for the content are all pretty useful. Each of the side missions are based on a particular main side character in the main storyline, and as you complete their quest lines, you'll unlock more crafting tools for your loadouts. So for example, the Poison Ivy quest line will have you complete the same mission about 4 or 5 times, but every time you are successful, Poison Ivy will grant you with a new elemental ability for you to attached to your weapons. The Penguin also has his own quest line, which gives you the ability to craft weapons, break them down for parts, and even re-roll certain stats to your favorite weapons, assuming that you have a favorite, that is. Now, despite all of the flaws with the mission structure, the short campaign, and the skill trees, we can at least say that Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is a good looter shooter, right? I mean, after all, this is what they were going for. Well, I think you know the answer already. And this is very ironic, as this was probably the one thing they needed to absolutely nail, as Rocksteady gambled their entire reputation on deviating from what they were known for with the Arkham series to create an alleged looter shooter. I mean, you can't make this shit up. And while I have tried a variety of different games in this genre, I can say for certain, whether it's an ARPG, an FPS MMO, or even an extraction shooter, the one thing that they all have in common is they have good loot. And whatever Suicide Squad's trying to do here is putting me to sleep. It's by far the most dull and boring loot system I have ever had the displeasure of engaging with. After completing any mission, whether it's from the main campaign, side quests, or endgame content, the game will pause and a loot crate will fly from the sky and land on your screen, letting you know what item you just acquired. Now, obviously there's no issue with loot as a reward, but this presentation makes me believe that they were planning to sell loot crates with weapons in them until the gaming market corrected course, pushing loot boxes out of the limelight. And since the game was taking so long to develop, rather than just rid the game of this loot crate system that they created, they thought it would be better to just integrate it into the mission reward structure instead. Now, was this the right decision for the devs to make? I don't know, but I'm glad that the devs decided to take the moral high ground and not create a gambling loot system inside of this already mess of a game. But despite everything we just talked about, there is still one issue that takes the cake, and that's that all of the loot is absolutely worthless. No weapons feel distinct from one another. They all have generic weapon designs, and the bland skins span across every class, which removes any level of uniqueness acquired through gameplay. I also don't think that any special weapons, such as an exotic that we have seen inside Destiny 2, or a special wonder weapon that we've seen inside of COD Zombies, have made their way into Suicide Squad. Perhaps they are treating the melee weapons associated with each character to be the specialty weapons, but that's quite unimaginative and limiting, since the moveset associated with these melee weapons is only allowed to have one attack animation. There are certain weapons you can unlock in the endgame that are under the highest rarity tier called infamous weapons, but as far as I can tell, at least with this launch season, there isn't anything that is special or unique about them other than their rarity. So whether it's crafting weapons or earning them via the endgame, they are all so uninspired, and it's just such a shame, since this was the cornerstone of the game. And the end result has players sticking with one or two guns that they like the best and never changing their loadout unless they get a higher tiered version of that exact same weapon. Okay, I want to take a bit of a break from dumping all over this game to talk about a few more positives that I believe Suicide Squad offers, and that's its boss fights. Being able to fight the Flash, the Green Lantern, Batman, and Superman was really awesome, and I thought the boss fights were pretty clever and attempted to think a bit out of the box when it came to taking down each enemy. The Flash and Superman encounters were probably the most similar out of the four, as the player attempts to stun and shoot them while dodging a barrage of environmental hazards. But the Batman and Green Lantern fights were pretty unique and brought about different ways to engage with the superhero villains through both narrative and gameplay elements, especially with Batman. Deep inside the Batcave, Bruce Wayne attempts to gas the Suicide Squad with a fear toxin, and rather than fight against the toxin, the Suicide Squad embraces it and enters what appears to be a hallucination of a fiery Batman. And while no one fight was particularly difficult, the Batman fight really stood out to me because it was just such a great spectacle. And I know I've mentioned this a few times throughout the review, but again, it's moments like these that I was really trying to hold on to, because it showed me that Rocksteady was deep in there somewhere. They have creativity, they had a vision, but this concept of a live service looter shooter just got in the way of any ambitious and creative ideas that could have brought about a unique experience. The Brainiac fight was my most anticipated moment of the game, which only turned out to be a repeat of the Flash fight, but with Brainiac's foot soldiers participating as well. Throughout the campaign, we learn that Brainiac is attempting to destroy more than just the Earth, as he is located throughout the dreaded multiverse, yes, I said it, where the Suicide Squad will need to take him down multiple times to stop his reign of terror. This final encounter in the preseason is actually just the first of 13, and while it's a little more tough than the other boss fights, it didn't feel special or climactic at all, and there is a reason for that, as the remaining fights are being held back for seasonal updates, so no surprises there. But what's frustrating about all of this is that the multiverse cheapens literally everything inside of this game. It means that death matters not at all, since there is just another version of a person in another universe we can check out at an undetermined date. It likely means that we didn't actually kill the Justice League at all, because the series will just pivot to another universe whenever they're ready, which is probably the right call to make considering the critical reception of this game. While the campaign has its ups and downs, traditionally games like this don't rely on the campaign, and it's just a means to an end, as the actual end game content is where players will spend most of their time. And I've been hearing a lot of talk about the end game and how boring and repetitive the mission structure is, and that's partially true. As with a lot of elements of this game, I am torn with how I interpret things, because it's clear that Rocksteady did put in the effort for the end game, but a lot of the things that make an end game worth it fall completely short. Once Brainiac has been defeated and Metropolis is left open to the player, there was actually a lot of stuff to grind for. The problem is, the rewards are just not worth your time. There is a new set of tiers to unlock called Raising Hell, which are challenges to complete across any and all aspects of the game. 3 new missions pop up called Finite Crisis missions that take place in the multiverse, and yes, these are things that you have done before again, but they are just a bit more difficult. However, once these 3 challenges are completed, a 4th Finite Crisis portal will open, and surprisingly, it's a new piece of in-game content. a survival mission that has you killing enemies for as long as you can under increasing difficulty. And it's actually quite enjoyable. But the way that all of this works is the more finite crisis missions you complete, the higher your finite progression meter will go up, which allows you to unlock more and more loot. And I say this to tell you that there is a genuine amount of content to grind through at launch. There is the campaign with 5 boss fights, 23 side quests, the contract system, the Riddler challenges, community service challenges, the Raising Hell challenge system, and the finite crisis missions. And they're all paired with their own reward and loot pools. So when you combine all of that with the crafting mechanics and the 5 skill trees, there is surprisingly quite a bit to do. The problem is, it's all superficial. When I think about what's ahead for this game, I see a similar future as many of the other live service blunders that have come across the gaming industry over the last handful of years. Anthem, Outriders 2, Lawbreakers, Marvel's Avengers, failed live service after failed live service, yet these studios keep trying. I seriously don't think fans of Rocksteady ever expected that they, of all developers, would succumb to the will of the live service looter-shooter genre, designed around kneecapping consumers and patting the pockets of people who have never touched a video game in their entire lives. The gatekeeping of what could have been an amazing campaign with multiple variants of a Brainiac boss fight was instead swapped out for a seasonal drip feeding method that no one will stick around for. In today's gaming marketplace, it's never been more clear that player retention is king to get fans to spend real-life currency in-game, as the data currently suggests that with retention increases of just 5% in-game, that will convert to an increase of profits by roughly 25%. And even with that information, Rocksteady appears to have removed the Loot Crate storefront to sell cheap skins for King Shark at a whopping $30 a pop. But how can a studio expect to make any conversion sales at all when their concurrent player counts are in the toilet? I suppose the few questions that keep bouncing around in my mind are, why did Rocksteady make this type of video game? What purpose does it serve, and ultimately who is it for? And to be straight up with you guys, I have no earthly idea. But what I do know is that Rocksteady tried to spread their influence too far across too many subgenres and ended up creating a subpar product in the process. Personally, I was expecting nothing major from Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Just another mindless looter shooter with no personality or depth to it at all. But despite all of this game's drawbacks, Rocksteady was still able to create something interesting with characters that had emotional depth and gunplay that was fun enough to hold my attention for roughly 30 hours. Will I go back and check out Suicide Squad when Season 2 rolls around? Sure, maybe if I have some extra time, but it isn't on my to-do list, as I would much rather go back to their older titles to see their talents being utilized properly inside of a single-player experience. Just be sure if you do decide to pick this one up that your expectations are tempered and very reasonable. Otherwise, you may just want to give it a pass. And if you're interested in seeing another game that people have been passing up when they shouldn't be, click here to check that review out right now.